Evening, everyone. I'm going to start by calling our panelist here. Let me start with Ulrika Britton, who is the Deputy Director General for Public Finance. Can we give her a round of applause? Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Amina Ibrahim from UN WIDER. Thank you for joining us. Andrew Donaldson is on stage already. Welcome, Andrew. And lastly, let's put our hands together for Dr. Tim Kohler from the DPRU. So, welcome to this session on active labor market programs. What does the research tell us? You've probably already heard over the last day and a half that unemployment remains exceptionally high, and it is one of the most persistent challenges that we face in South Africa. We have amongst the highest unemployment rates in the world, and youth unemployment is probably at crisis levels at the moment. At the same time, while we have this major unemployment problem, we know that government is investing billions of rands in a wide range of active labor market programs, as well as public employment programs. These interventions, as you will find out in this session, are delivered by multiple departments and public entities across government, and in many cases, these interventions pursue similar objectives through somewhat different approaches. And so this very busy and fragmented landscape raises a number of questions. The first question is, and this will resonate with the economists in the room, is, are we solving for the right problem? Are we investing in the right interventions? Are we really addressing structural unemployment, which is a main feature of the problem in South Africa? And how are we allocating resources towards these ALMPs? In South Africa, these questions are not just academic. They are central to how government responds to the problems of structural unemployment. So the research that will be presented today is particularly important in helping us to answer how we deal with unemployment. And rather than looking at these programs in isolation through discrete evaluations, we're going to start off with our first guest speaker. Ulrika will look at a study that looks at the ALMP system as a whole and how it's performed. And as public finance practitioners and policymakers, what she's going to present is particularly relevant. Because ultimately, from a public finance perspective, and I guess from a government perspective, every rand that we allocate to employment programs represents an opportunity cost. The economics students here hopefully will know what that word means, right? An opportunity cost. It means that we have to, if we spend in public employment programs, we're basically not spending on something else. And the challenge, therefore, is not about spending more necessarily, it's about how we spend better. And how do we also direct our very scarce resources towards interventions that actually generate employment? So I'd like you to, in today's discussion, reflect on some of these issues as panelists, and also talk through some of the implications around policy and also program design and resource allocation. Before we start, I've been asked to remind everyone that is online or our online participants to please post your questions. Vusi will consolidate them and we will have an opportunity to ask them to the panelists a bit later. And with that, it is my greatest pleasure to invite our first speaker, Ulrika Britton, to present the findings from a review of ALMP programs in South Africa. Can we give her a round of applause?
Thank you very much, everybody, and good afternoon. This review comes out of some work that we had commissioned as part of some of the budgeting work that we are doing around understanding the effectiveness and the efficiency of spending. And budget pressures in relation to some of our public employment programs and other interventions around the labor market had suggested that we have to first understand what it is that we're doing with the money that we currently have before we are able to think about how do we spend money or add money in the budget to some of the newer programs that were emerging through the system. So, the presentation follows some logic around just understanding the nature of the problem, because that's where we always think about where good policy making starts. And then I'll spend some time about what the review says, and then what does it mean for some of the things that we are thinking about in the budget. Let me go straight into it. So, when we look at the numbers, only 41% of working adults, which is about 17 million out of nearly 42, were employed in 2025. And this is far below the 55 to 60% norm in comparable developing economies, and it's actually worse than our own 46% in 2008. So the maths around all of this is stark. So between 2008 and 2025, the working age population grew by 10.1 million people, but the employment only grew by 2.5 million. And that means that for every 4 new entrants to the working age population, only 1 found a job. Even more telling is the education dimension. Employment among people without matric actually declined by over 1.3 million over the same period. But employment rates fell for all education groups. Those with tertiary education saw employment rates drop from 82% to 71%, and for matric holders from 56% to 45%. So this tells us something fundamental in how we have to think about what the policy response is to this. It's that we are simply, by producing more graduates, we won't solve the unemployment problem. And whilst our education system produces more qualified people than what the economy creates, the binding constraint here is not skills supply, but it's actually labor demand. And there are 2 features of our labor market that make the demand problem even harder to solve. The first is a spatial dimension. So employment rates in former Bantustan and rural areas can be below 20%. And the research by Lockman in the paper using the National Income Dynamics Survey showed that over 50% of unemployed people who left former Bantustan areas in 2017 found work, compared to under 20% of those who stayed. Large numbers of South Africans are effectively trapped in places where no realistic prospect of employment exists. And the second is probably a little bit of a more underappreciated point, but I suppose what's come through in the conversations here is around that our informal sector being far too small. Informal employment accounts for only 16% of total employment compared to the median of about 45% in peer middle income countries. And South Africa is a conspicuous outlier. We combine the highest unemployment rate with unusually low informality. So in most developing countries, the informal sector acts as a buffer. It absorbs workers who can't find the jobs, and in South Africa, this buffer hardly exists. And the reasons are structural. Poverty in informal sector economies mean thin profit margins, intense competition, higher crime, lower demand, and the informal economy can only grow much faster if household incomes are able to absorb that growth. So the implication for our ALMPs are clear. Interventions cannot succeed unless they address the weak labor demand directly, and improving employability or matching efficiency will have limited impact on the fundamental problem of too few jobs, spatial inclusion, or spatial exclusion rather, and a constrained informal sector. So that defines the nature of the problem. So now, in looking at the various programs that we have, is how do we respond to all of this? And let's just kind of set the scene about our active labor market ecosystem. So we have 43 different programs that sits across 16 national departments. So in 2024-25, expenditure was approximately 60.2 billion rand, and collectively it reached about 2.8 million beneficiaries. But we need careful interpretation of what beneficiaries means, and I'll get to that a little bit later about why this matters in the context of all of these programs and the fragmented nature in how we then monitor performance and effectiveness. So, and the reason why that matters is because these 2.8 million beneficiaries can range anywhere from the 4 months of work that happens in a public employment program to a 2-day workshop to a 10-minute engagement in a labor center. All of those things are then counted as part of these 2.8 million beneficiaries in the year that we looked at the review. From a budgeting point of view, it tells an important story. So the first is that the table shows a breakdown of the World Bank's classification framework, and it's evolved from the OECD's labor market context where unemployment was driven by skills mismatches and frictional unemployment, and not necessarily the deep structural demand constraints that we face in South Africa. So when you look at the spending distributions, so 45%, or nearly 27 billion rand in 24-25, goes to incentives for human capital enhancement. These are primarily the Sector Education Training Authority funded programs. A further 24% goes into work exposure programs, 20% into enterprise support and employment creation, and only 11%, or 6.6 billion rand, goes into incentives to actually seek a job. So the critical question here is, in a labor market where the binding constraint is insufficient demand for unskilled labor, will half the spending in our budget on skills development generate meaningful employment gains? Why is it not moving? So what we did in the review, instead of using the standard OECD and World Bank categories, we proposed assessing these ALMPs through the lens of 4 channels, each representing a pathway increasing the demand for unskilled labor. So the first one is the relative cost of unskilled labor, and this would be through wage subsidies and hiring incentives. The second one is through the increased growth in labor-intensive sectors through productive incentives and enterprise support. The third is to address the shortages in the complementary inputs, so this is scarce skills or infrastructure that constrain the growth in unskilled labor. And the fourth is whether we are directly creating employment through our public employment programs. And for each of these interventions, we had to ask the difficult question, so does the intervention create net new employment, or does it merely shuffle the queue? Are there large deadweight costs? And would the activity really would have happened without the subsidy in any? And are the skills that are being produced actually demanded by employers? So what have we found? So as I'd explained earlier, we had these 43 programs with approximately 60 billion rands expenditure in 2024-25. Over half of our ALMP spending went into either vocational training or combined vocational and workplace training. And public employment programs received about 13.7 billion rand, or 23% of the spending. And entrepreneurship and enterprise support got nearly 8 billion rand. So the problem here wasn't that each of these programs were bad. I can't think of a better word than saying that it was necessarily bad. The problem is that the portfolio has evolved incrementally over time, and it's driven by diverse policy objectives across a wide range of departments. And there's no unified theory of change, with no common metrics for measuring effectiveness, And there's no integrated strategic choice making as a result of that. And because that didn't exist, it is very difficult to think about how, in a constrained environment, you have to think about prioritization. And because our programs were not designed to work together or address the binding constraint in the labor market, there may be some duplication, and others may address problems that are just simply not drivers of employment. And this is probably the most sobering slide in the presentation. When we classified expenditure on ALMPs by its estimated impact on unskilled employment, the results are striking. Only 19 billion rand, which is most of the public employment programs, show a strong or likely strong impact on the demand for unskilled labor. And that was only about a third of the total spending we have in the ecosystem. 37%, which is most of the CETA funding, or 37 billion rand, which is most of the CETA funding, and other programs, was determined to be likely weak in how it performs in relation to creating unskilled or demand for unskilled labor. 4.4 billion rand, which is mostly the employment tax incentive, has a weak impact based on the evidence that we had. But why is the spending this ineffective? The programs are built on assumptions that are better suited for other labor markets. They assume that unemployment is caused by matching frictions or skill shortages, when our dominant constraint is really around the insufficient labor demand. Training for jobs that don't exist or improving matching in a market that have too few vacancies cannot significantly reduce unemployment. So the report notes that we have many interventions that may improve employability for particular interventions without materially reducing aggregate unemployment. And this is really just reshuffling the queue. So some people move forward and others move back in the system. But we do know that our public employment programs are probably those with the most direct and effective instrument for increasing the demand for unskilled labor. The EPWP created over 900,000 jobs in 2024-25, which is equivalent to 392 full-time equivalents. And that means that on any given day, about 400 people were working in public employment programs, representing about 2.5% of total national employment. 60% of the EPWP expenditures goes into wages, so the labor intensity is relatively high. And that then shows that there's good targeting of the program in meeting those objectives around employment. The program also targets poor households and has significant poverty reduction effects, and also has good spatial targeting towards high unemployment regions. But there are important weaknesses in the system. There's limited evidence that public employment programs transition into permanent employment afterwards. The structural constraints to employability remain after participation ends, and without complementary interventions such as training linked to employer demand, certification, or job placement, public employment programs really just functions as a temporary income support. So why do we have this problem? So in the context of policy making, and in this slide, we show the traffic light framework to compare supply-side ALMPs with public employment programs through the lens of theory of change. So supply-side ALMPs are fundamentally addressing the wrong problem. So even though they were perfectly designed and implemented, improving employability in a demand-constrained market will not significantly increase aggregate employment. The logic chain breaks at the very first step, the problem identification phase of policy design. The result is limited or no employment outcomes for unskilled labor and almost no impact on aggregate employment. And when you compare that to the public employment programs, we're addressing the right problem. It increases the demand for unskilled labor, but it creates the short-term employment and decreases aggregate unemployment in the short term. But however, the design and the implementation could only improve around creating pathways into sustained employment outcomes. So the takeaway message is strategic: to shift resources from interventions that address the wrong problem into interventions that address the right one, but simultaneously improving the design of those interventions. One of the bigger problems we have in understanding the effectiveness of the system as a whole relates to having proper evidence to make the right decisions at the right time. And whilst our M&E systems measure activity, they don't necessarily measure the impact or the effectiveness and outcomes around the programs that work. So most of the programs that we have in the system monitor easily measurable indicators. So these are the participants enrolled, people trained, enterprises supported. But these are inputs and activities, not outcomes and impact. They can't tell us whether beneficiaries secure sustained employment, or they transition into livelihoods, or improve their earnings over time. And beneficiary systems across the various programs are generally absent or weak, and departments cannot reliably track participants once they exit the programs. One of the bigger problems we've had in the system is that the definitions and indicators across the different departments significantly differ. Even basic questions like what counts as a job or is sustained as a job are answered differently in different programs. So it makes program comparisons very difficult and almost meaningless. We also, and this is probably a general practice in government that we don't do as well, is that we don't have rigorous impact evaluations across various government programs. The main exception, I suppose, is the employee tax incentive program. But without this counterfactual analysis, comparing what happened to participants versus what would have happened without the program, we can't determine whether these observed outcomes are attributable to the interventions that we're making. So where does this take us to? The report makes a couple of important recommendations that kind of deals across the public financial management system. And the first, of course, relates to some of the budgetary considerations that we have here. And despite the imperfect evidence that we have, the case for action is clear. So we face an important tension right now. On the one hand, we have a lack of evidence on the effectiveness of many of these programs, but on the other hand, we can't sit and wait for perfect data while we spend about 60 billion rand a year on programs that may not be working. So what are the principles that we think about when we have to guide some of these budgeting decisions? One, I think, is important that we acknowledge the evidence gap. The second is that we prioritize the labor-absorbing interventions, and this is not necessarily a decision about the outcomes of what it is we're doing in the budget at the moment, but it does give us some leeway, policy leeway, to at least consider this. The third principle is around how do we redesign or consolidate and discontinue these weak-performing programs. So, I mean, it's fragmented. 43 programs across 16 departments in itself, by design, is a source of inefficiency, and there's something that can be done about that quite immediately. And then the last one, which is a long-term mechanism, is how do we embed this evidence generation into future budgeting decisions that we make. What does it mean for the PFM system that we have? One, like I said, is address the structural problem just around the absence of a coherent system. So we have to think about this as not just these individual programs, but as a whole system, an ecosystem of interventions that work. And this is done through, one, doing a unified theory of change that addresses the structural unemployment problems. The second recommendation is around how do we integrate this oversight into the budget process, and that's relatively easy to do, I think, given the reporting nature within the legislative framework. And then the third is how do we then use the budget process to rationalize some of these programs. The second big recommendation is around strengthening monitoring and evaluation so that we can make the evidence-based decisions around all of this. And this is about introducing common outcome indicators with standardized definitions across all these programs, strengthening the beneficiary tracking and using the various data mechanisms through the Digital Public Infrastructure Roadmap to help us with that. And then lastly is how do we embed evaluation into the program design. This includes how we establish baselines, compare different control groups, use longitudinal data as a follow-up, but also being aware that these comes with significant deadweight costs. So the message around all of this is that we need clear criteria for when ALMP should undergo impact evaluation and develop a prioritized program for evaluation. So let me just say that there are 3 key takeaways from this review. The first is that our problem is a demand problem. It's not a supply-side intervention. Most of our interventions that are on the supply side are ineffective tools to respond to this problem. The most effective tool that we currently have in the system are the public employment programs. But we also acknowledge that we need to design improvements to support the transitions into sustained work. The bulk of our spending on supply-side interventions are unlikely to generate significant aggregate employment gains. And lastly, we can't continue spending 60 billion rand on decisions without proper evidence. So building the monitoring, tracking, and evaluation systems is an urgent priority and not a nice to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ulrika. I am going to ask Dr. Mina to please provide your inputs. I think you have a presentation. Okay, great stuff. Thanks. Can we have the next slide?
Right, thank you so much. I think this is going to be my last intervention at the conference. I think I've spoken to the students now for the 3rd time, but it's really great still to be here and to be engaging, and the conversations during the coffee breaks and the questions and answers have been really interesting. I'm going to go back a little bit to yesterday's discussion and start where I started there yesterday, and then I'll go into the discussion on this kind of tax policy side so you understand where I'm coming from, because it's a little bit different to the discussions that we've had so far. So yesterday I started off with saying that public economics is fundamentally about how governments raise revenue, how we allocate spending, so this is what we spoke about now, and how to evaluate if a policy is working or not, so what we still need to do. And when I was invited to do this presentation, I thought hard about what this means from the kind of public economic side, so from this government revenue collection side, from the tax policy side, from the formalization side, and how this plays out for unemployment and youth. So for me, the bigger picture starts kind of in terms of our demographics and what that challenge looks like. I was at a workshop a couple months ago. It was a tax and demographics workshop. It was hosted by the OECD, but one thing that was really striking was that the OECD has an aging and shrinking workforce. Right? So policies that the OECD are implementing at the moment, or OECD countries are implementing at the moment, are fundamentally looking at a very different population. Regionally, we may hear this often, sometimes it's quoted a lot in the media, Africa remains this kind of youngest population globally. In South Africa, the challenge is really about this kind of early entry into formal work and what that actually means for our tax net. So what does that mean for tax collection? What does that mean for revenue? So the way in which I thought about this was to think about how can tax policy support these goals? And if tax and labor policies succeed, Africa as a continent within which South Africa sits will have more global workers that actually serve the tax base globally. So not just in the country, but actually in the whole world. So that's like a thought experiment somewhere else, right? To think about the global workforce is actually going to be driven from this continent in the next couple of years. But what we do and how do we get there depends on some of our policy choices. now. I suspected that I'd be looped into this discussion on the ETI, although I recognize that Andrew's going to talk a little bit more about this, but it felt like I needed to say something. So I've just got one slide on the ETI, and there were two questions that came up yesterday in relation to it in terms of the evidence. So from my point of view, and Sibusiso aptly mentioned it, there's a lot of evidence on the employment tax incentive. Many of us have studied it, partly because there was an actual evaluation strategy in the planning, but also because of the data availability to do so. So we spoke a lot about data yesterday. Josh Budlander spoke about data collection to actually answer the questions. And this leads to a really nice example of how you can actually evaluate a policy. So I think the conclusion, irrespective of the view, is that the ETI by itself actually won't solve South Africa's youth unemployment problem. There is no silver bullet, that's been said several times today. By design, in its initial first 3 years, the policy was supposed to create 178,000 jobs. So that's in the paper, right? Now, when we have millions of unemployed young people, it's a really small number. And I think Andrew's going to talk a little bit more about how we scale up. But the policy has seen take-up growth, more and more eligible workers, the number of people that are being subsidized. What we don't really know a lot about is what happens to this in the kind of long term. So if you're in subsidized employment for a 2-year period, maximum 2 years, what happens afterwards? Do you fall back into unemployment? Do you continue to be employed? Are you underemployed? What is the quality of your job? How long do you stay employed? Does it fundamentally actually change the trajectory, which we believe it should? There's a difference in the application of the ETI and special economic zones under research topics. So for students in the room looking for thesis topics or research topics, there's a whole list for you. The last one I want to mention is actually during COVID, the ETI was expanded in terms of the number of workers that were actually eligible to claim and the actual value of the ETI. I think at some point it went up to 80% of the wage. Again, so far, I actually haven't seen a single study that looks at this yet. So while there are lots of questions to ask, or that have been answered, and we know a lot about it, there is some other questions that still could be asked. And our esteemed colleague, or esteemed panel yesterday, both the DG and the CG, talked a lot about data and where to access that. And then I should give a shout out to my colleagues here in Pretoria who run the SA Tide program and support the National Treasury with their secure data lab facility. So that's where the tax administrative data is located. So for those who are interested in using and answering some of these questions, that's where you should go. So coming back to this idea of youth informality and the taxpayers. So this is an important question for public finance and as somebody who thinks a lot about how to actually collect revenue. So young South Africans, when they do find work, many of them are in the informal sector, right? So the Stats SA numbers, 50% of youth are in informal employment. But this really matters because informal employment often doesn't have the kind of social protections or the protections that formal employment does have, right? So we're thinking about pensions, we're thinking about UIF, and those contributions that are important, those are lifetime contributions. So if you're not contributing and you're not saving and you're not working on those things early on in your career, because you're in informal employment and there's nothing left at the end of the day and your job doesn't give it to you, where are you going to be in 30, 40 years' time? That's a question also for us to ask in terms of our demographic later on, right? So we've got no pension that's being collected. And for me, this kind of ETI fits into this larger kind of policy design challenge, right? So thinking about lowering the cost of employing young workers might help, but perhaps only at the margin, right? So for me, the question really is about what kind of tax policies can shift workers and firms, so informal businesses, from formality into the formal tax net, right? Because as the tax authority, we need to collect tax and revenue, and we need to allocate spending, but how do we do that? We need people in the formal sector. There was a really great question yesterday by a student who sat somewhere here in the middle to SARS that said, well, have we reached our ceiling on personal income tax if we're not getting more people into formal employment? It was a really nice thought process, right? Because Professor Borat's presentation yesterday also told us a lot about, well, we could kind of match the ratio number a little bit higher. We're at that 50 number instead of 45 for our formal employment, but we're falling short a lot on our informal employment. And I agree, and the discussion this morning spoke a lot about informality, but that actually doesn't do a lot for our fiscal space. That doesn't actually help us in terms of how we're going to think about collecting revenue in the future. So I started to think a little bit about what else can we think about on the kind of tax policy side that links to employment, and what have we done, what we could do, and maybe in the discussion we can talk a little bit more about some of the international observations. So I really like the metaphor of the environment and the soil, and so what I'm really talking about on the slide is about creating the tax policy environment that actually creates jobs. So thinking about, at the moment, we have lots of corporate income tax incentives. We have a simplified regime for small firms, digitization. But what I'm thinking about is actually tax policy that's tied to job creation. So could we think about incentives for small businesses to actually formalize and actually go into the tax net? An investment in kind of sectoral incentives for job creation. So this is not about stopping the ETI necessarily. So I'm not talking about taking something away, but rather thinking about this as a kind of package of policies in tax design. My last slide, and I want to end on this broader point about this kind of not one policy is going to fix everything and this one silver bullet that's going to do everything. And I think we're starting to have this discussion now, kind of policy coherence and policies talking to each other, measuring them in similar ways, and looking very carefully at what is actually leading to this kind of growth and job creation. So growth matters to create jobs. Growth matters, and it's important for firms who create jobs, and firms that expand and invest create more jobs. So the two pictures on the screen is about the policy message, right? So if we think that, or we know, or we want to believe that the destination is job-led growth, we spoke a little bit about that this morning. What I want to think about a little bit is actually what are the policies, or which are the trains that need to leave the station. So not just talking about the policy options, but which are the trains and the policies that actually need to be moving in order to get there. And here you can think a little bit about sequencing as well. So which is the first policy, which is the second policy, which is the next policy, and how to create that. I want to be very clear though, there's a lot of discussion on the informal sector, and I don't want to come across to say that actually I think we should be taxing the informal sector. So in many of the other African countries that I work in, they have a different ratio. They have the formal employment, they've got large informal sector, and what a lot of the administration does or thinks about and is trying to do is tax the informal sector. And I think that's not what, for me, the message is. I've been thinking hard about what we can actually think about in terms of large unemployment, but how to move that large unemployment actually into the formal sector, because that's going to bring us the revenue in terms of in a kind of public finance sense. Now let me circle back to this initial idea about Africa as the youth workforce going forward. There was an interesting discussion in Europe about this. Because initially the discussion is around, actually, we don't want immigrants to come and work in Europe. So that's predominant discussion, a lot of political discussions at the moment in Europe. We don't want more immigrants to come. But there's also quietly this kind of acknowledgement that actually they do not have the workforce, and they will, in the next couple of years, start looking for that workforce elsewhere. And it was interesting because Yiko's comment about this kind of bilateral agreements where South Africa can actually send people to work elsewhere, I think something like that's going to be really interesting. And I think it's interesting from a public finance question, because where are those people going to be taxed? Not in South Africa. They're going to be taxed elsewhere. So if our workforce is going to start leaving, what is the implications for that in our public finance? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amina. Andrew, it's your turn. Andrew doesn't have a slide deck, but you'll talk to us. Right.
Thank you, Amanda. So I want to start off by trying to locate this discussion about active labor market policies, but more broadly about employment in the context of a development strategy. South Africa doesn't just have an unemployment problem. Of course, we have a large unemployment problem, but we also have a living standards problem. Far too many people live in conditions that are nowhere near the living standards that we aspire to, live in urban or rural areas with inadequate and irregular electricity and water supplies, and so on and so on and so on. So we clearly have a development objective around living standards that we need to be thinking about alongside our discussion about employment. We have an investment problem. We're investing 14% of GDP. That's nowhere near enough to generate the kind of economic growth that is needed over time to raise living standards and raise employment in the formal sector in the economy. We also have a fiscal problem, so we've got to think about solutions to these challenges that don't make our fiscal position and our debt position any worse. And you have to think about these things jointly. Now, how does that relate to this review of active labor market policies? Well, one thing that I like in this review is that it emphasizes the demand side. It says you can throw a lot of money at preparing people for work opportunities, but if the economy is not generating work opportunities, that's like pushing on a string. It's not going to get you anywhere, and I completely agree with that. But I think there's a rather simplistic language in this review that says we need to create demand for unskilled labor, that's our challenge. I would not put it like that. Many of the things that contribute to expanding employment opportunities are not about unskilled labor. They're about many different mixes of skills and capabilities, and we need to be careful about just focusing on the unskilled labor needs. Although we have to be conscious that there are far higher unemployment rates at levels of lower education outcomes, and so on and so on. That's obviously true. But I think it's more helpful to use the language of economics, of labor economics, in thinking about how employment is generated. Employment, in labor economics terms, is a derived demand. It's derived from, in the private sector, in the business environment, from the expanded opportunities that businesses face if they're successful and profitable and need to expand their productive capacity and employ more people as a consequence of that. In public service delivery and in the public sector's contribution to improved living standards, infrastructure development in urban areas, the demand for labor in public employment programs is also a derived demand. Justin reminded us this morning of the Great Depression and the huge employment challenges that the US faced in the 1930s, and the role of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in over time addressing the challenges of the New Deal. The flagship program in the New Deal was called the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's an act passed by Congress in 1933, and it created a huge umbrella organization that built half a dozen dams, that put in place flood control systems on the Tennessee Valley Authority, that reforested the landscape where soil erosion was destroying the water systems in the environment. It built hydroelectric power plants on those dams and water systems, and today the Tennessee Valley Authority is the single largest electricity utility in the United States. So you have to link your employment initiatives, the things you're doing to address the formal employment shortfalls in the economy. You have to do that in ways that are also going to build the infrastructure that we need in future and address the living standard challenges that we face. I think that Josh's presentation this morning was exactly right on the biggest employment program we have, which is the Basic Education Employment Program. It's not a great program because it employs 200,000 people a year, provided the Treasury provides the money for that. It's a great program because it improves what's going on in those schools. It makes for better education outcomes. But as soon as you think about employment programs as temporary initiatives, as, yes, there's money for this year, but not next year, or we'll talk about next year, then you stop thinking about the long-term development potential of those initiatives. So we need to think about our public. I completely agree with the emphasis on public employment programs in this review, but it's not just about the employment benefits. It's also about achieving the development outcomes that we need. And when we think about employment programs in that way, we will surely make more progress, not just in creating jobs, but also in addressing our living standards challenges. Now, very quickly on the employment tax incentive. Public employment programs are about the role that the state and its many different programs, environmental programs, water programs, fire protection. We need these things not just to employ people, we need these things because we need this work to be done. The point about the employment tax incentive is that it's about providing a fiscal incentive, just a contribution, not the full costs of these programs, of this employment program, not by any means, to the private sector, to the business sector of the economy, which is 80% of the economy's employment and economic activity anyway. Tax incentives are a far better way of going about this than selective spending programs, because once you've changed the tax law, 500,000 businesses can respond to that. And the tax authority puts in place the mechanisms that are needed to police the implementation of it. You don't need the entire bureaucracy that you need to run the kinds of initiatives that we're trying to do through the DEL or the Youth Development Agency programs, many of the other active labor market programs, which have these high administrative costs and very weak outcomes associated with them. But it's no surprise at all that the youth employment incentive as currently designed doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work. You don't need evidence, you don't need analysis, you don't need numbers, you just need Economics 101 to know that it's not going to work. Why? Because it doesn't change the demand for labor. All it does is make it a little easier, perhaps, for young people to get jobs for 1 year, and that's the only savings in costs that goes to the employer. 1 year and then a second year at half the rate. That's how the youth employment incentive works. First-time job seekers for 1 year and then half the amount for a second year, and then the incentive falls away. This incentive was designed in the same way, basically, as the Earned Employment Tax Credit, which is the single most important poverty relief and income support program in the United States. And it provides a cash-back subsidy to low-income earners who are registered for tax purposes, irrespective of how many jobs they have, where they're working, and it and if they're low-income earners, the incentive is paid like a sort of a negative tax credit. And those who are familiar with the public finance economics of this will, of course, recognize that idea. We tax people above the tax threshold. We can provide a subsidy to people who earn below the tax threshold, and that's what the employment incentive is supposed to do. But if it's only limited to young people for 1 year or for 2 years, it doesn't change the dynamics of low-cost job creation. It doesn't change the fundamental economics of labor-intensive businesses. So if you want the employment tax incentive to work, it has to be a universal benefit to all low-wage employees, perhaps in particular sectors. Obviously, there are some sectors in which it's easier to apply than in others. And it changes the derived demand for labor because it reduces the costs of doing business to labor-intensive activities, restaurants, hotels, catering businesses, furniture and clothing and textiles activities that are trying to compete with the low-wage economies of Southeast Asia internationally. If we want to create jobs in those industries, we have to make them cost competitive, and partially subsidizing the cost of labor in labor-intensive activities is one way of doing it. The tax system is a better way of doing it than trying to do it through spending programs. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Tim, thank you. All right, I'm going to hand over to Tim.
Great. Thanks very much, Amanda. Thanks to GTAC for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. I'm going to shift away from the really important and fantastic work and discussion surrounding the ETI, but remain within the ALMP space. Perhaps transition first to a different type of labor market policy that isn't necessarily, at least traditionally, explicitly designed to, like ALMPs are, shift the unemployed into good quality jobs, but instead a set of policies that aim to simply provide support to the unemployed during their state of unemployment, right? It may seem irrelevant to this discussion, but I'm hoping that I'll make it clear how these policies need not be mutually exclusive. I'm going to talk about cash transfers, otherwise known as social grants in South Africa. So often around the world known as a passive labor market policy, or a form of social assistance as a broader form of, as part of the broader system of social protection, right? Many of us in the room probably know that cash transfers, I think, are most likely the most common anti-poverty tool across countries globally, especially in lower middle income countries. They form a key component of social protection systems globally, and they often come in many forms. Some are completely unconditional, some are conditional on meeting some sort of criterion, like sending your kids to school. But for the most part, their primary aim is usually poverty alleviation, broadly speaking, right? So a raising of living standards. But of course, we have a huge, credible, empirical evidence base now that's developed over the last 2 decades, I would guess, that shows that receiving a cash transfer tends to incur benefits on recipients across a wide range of development outcomes, right? So this includes educational attainment, physical and mental health, school attendance, etc. Despite these well-established benefits, there's a persistent concern globally and in South Africa for a long time now that social grants or cash transfers can discourage work, right? That they make people lazy. There's this myth of, Abhijit Banerjee puts it as the myth of the welfare recipient, right? The lazy welfare recipient. Interestingly, neoclassical economic theory does predict negative effects of receiving a social grant on participating in the labor market, on looking for work, for instance. But the neoclassical model, as some students here might know, does not account for various frictions, or some economists call it market failures, that characterize every labor market in the world, right? One example of these are job search costs as a friction, right? It's costly to look for work. It's also risky to set up a business, for instance. So turning from theory to the empirics, it's not surprising then that the predictions of the theoretical model, those negative effects, most often don't show up. Sometimes they do. Most often, we don't see negative effects. For the most part, as far as I recall, we see close to zero or small but positive effects on labor market participation. So it's very clear that social grants have the ability to not only provide support as a passive policy to the unemployed while they're unemployed, this is thinking about this particular subgroup, right? But also potentially address the constraints that are stopping them from participating in the labor market, right? Which is exactly what active labor market policy tries to do, at least from the supply side. However, this is more complicated in settings of structural unemployment. One could view structural unemployment as a sort of double-edged sword, in my view. For instance, the very conditions that justify targeting or giving cash to a group of the population who struggle to get work, like the working age unemployed population, they don't have any other means of income support, right? Especially if they haven't worked in the formal sector before, so they can't access UIF. So let's provide cash to them. So that motivation coincides with the very conditions that might actually limit the effectiveness of this aspect of the policy, right? Getting them into work, right? This is simply one simple example is receiving cash can make it cheaper, right? Less costly to look for work. But in an environment where colleagues have already spoken about, Haroon spoke about it yesterday, in an environment where we have very few vacancies, very few jobs, available jobs, alongside constraints to alternatives like self-employment or informal employment, it's very difficult to think about how a cash transfer might both improve one's ability to participate in the labor market and also let that increased participation translate into actual employment, right? So we've done some work in this regard. This sort of leads to this key overarching research question of, you know, what can cash transfers, what can and can they not do if the overarching goal is to improve labor market outcomes? Of course, like I said, their usual goal is poverty alleviation, broadly speaking. So many are not explicitly designed, and it's certainly not the case here. So I'd like to chat for 2 minutes quickly, if I may, on the social relief of distress grant in particular. As many of you will know, the SRD came into place in 2020 in the wake of the pandemic. It was initially planned to be temporary for 6 months. It was since been extended, and now it's been in place for about 6 years. And it looks like in some form it will become a permanent fixture of South Africa's social protection system. It's obviously unclear at the moment. There's various indications of that. The SRD is the first cash transfer or social grant to be targeted at unemployed working age adults in the country, ever. It's the first grant to make use of a labor market criterion. So arguably, it's not just a passive tool. One can view it more holistically as both passive and potentially an active labor market policy. But that's what we need to evaluate here. So we've done some work where we tried to see, well, what happens to recipients as well as their co-resident household members? What happens when they receive this grant? We know from existing literature conducted by colleagues, both in the room and outside during the pandemic and afterwards, that the grant was progressively distributed to poorer households. There seems to be some compelling descriptive evidence that it reduces food insecurity, improves mental health, etc. Very descriptive stuff. Turning to causality, and this speaks to the discussion here about monitoring and evaluation, it's been very difficult to establish causal evidence of what this grant does with respect to any outcome. And I think we can chat about that later, but it largely, in my head, is a consequence of data availability and the absence of specific measures in the surveys that we have available here. But essentially, in our work, we made use of the official labor market survey, the QLFS, We applied what is known as a staggered diff and diff design, which I won't get into detail here, but many of you will know of. It's one of the most popular quantitative social science quasi-experimental methods, so to speak, to isolate a causal effect and distinguish it from a mere correlation, right? So again, it speaks to what Ulrika was speaking about, this counterfactual. We're trying to see what happens to recipients had they not received the grant, and then we compare it to what actually happened to them, because in reality they did, and any difference in that outcome is the causal effect. Jumping straight into the results, and I was tempted to make slides here, but I have a tendency to just blab on, so I thought let's just keep it concise. We find on average positive effects. We look at 3 outcomes. We look at probabilities of engaging in any type of job search, of reporting that you've tried to start a business, and then of course actual employment status. We find relatively small but positive significant effects on average. We also look at the effects not only of receiving the grant, but also losing it relative to those who continue to receive the grant. And we find negative effects, which are often larger than those positive effects. For the behavioral economics students in the room, you might be thinking about loss aversion, which is quite relevant here. What I'd like to emphasize here, though, is that when we disentangle these effects to look at dynamics in particular, so not just on average what happens to you before to after receiving the grant compared to those who never receive it from before to after, we look at how it varies over time. We find that that positive employment effect dissipates very quickly to 0 following consecutive periods of receiving the grant. So for the majority of recipients, at least in that data, who continue to receive the grant, we don't see any difference, significant difference in employment outcomes compared to unemployed adults who never receive the grant. Importantly, it's not negative, it's just indistinguishable from 0. So again, there's no evidence here of discouragement or dependency, it's just nothing. And this need not be surprising, because we do still pick up those positive effects on job search and trying to start a business, but it's just that sort of intermediary channel doesn't seem to be translating into actually having a job. And this need not be surprising, because if you just look descriptively at the QLFS data, you'll know that for, how long has it been going for? 15, nearly 20 years. About 75% of the unemployed, broadly defined, report actively searching for work in the reference period. So unemployment need not be a function of a lack of effort, right? It's very clear that, at least for the large part, I think it's a lack of opportunity, which speaks to the demand side constraints, right? And this is consistent with the emphasis in the ALMP report. So briefly on implications here, it's this, and in relation to other grants in the country and the more broader international literature, it's clear that although social grants or cash transfers, conventionally designed as a form of social assistance or a passive labor market policy, it does have potential to act as an active labor market policy as well. It has potential to reduce the constraints that job seekers face in participating in the labor market, even at a relatively low value, like 350 or 370 as it is now. But in context of structural unemployment, where there quite literally are no vacancies to find, and as an alternative, it's really hard to start a business. Our self-employment rate, I don't know if this was discussed yesterday, I wasn't here, but it's at about 10%. I think for the typical upper middle income country, it's about 30%, and all else equal, complete oversimplification, but all else equal, our unemployment rate halves if we get it up to that 30% level, right? But we can't. There are constraints to doing so. So it's no surprise that we're not picking up these 0 employment effects. So we think this motivates, or I think this motivates a form of complementary support, that cash alone is important, but by itself perhaps insufficient. So this one sort of motivation here might be, or a promising direction might be a so-called cash plus model, which is becoming quite common around the world, where you complement the cash with complementary labor market linked support. This can be in the form of well-designed public employment programs. This can be in the form of business startup or expansion assistance. This can be various training initiatives, etc. But it's very important that whatever the plus is, which is the hard part, I think, it has to be tailored to the actual constraints that job seekers face. Not necessarily just incentivizing job search in a labor market that has no vacancies, right? So whatever form it takes, I think it needs to be the SRD and active labor market policies more broadly. It needs to be grounded in evidence on what they can and cannot achieve by themselves. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And give him a round of applause. Right, we have about 15 minutes for questions, and I'm going to start with Vusi and take 3 questions from our online audience. Vusi, do you have questions for us?
Am I on? 1, 2. Right, we do have 2 questions. I'm struggling to follow Kubisa's one. Maybe Kubisa, if you're listening, if you can just, when you put your questions, make them one, otherwise the staggered style makes it quite difficult to follow. 2 questions, I think, one from Spelele himself. He says, what if it's time for restructuring the South African educational system? Yeah. And the second one from Tafadzwa Ruzive is if tax money we return, to whom are we returning it, and how was it created in the first place? That's a question as written verbatim.
Okay, let me ask Ulrika to talk about what if we restructure the education system. Would that address our unemployment problem? And Andrew, do you want to answer the question on the tax? Who does it go to and for what? Ulrika?
So, I mean, I think the important component that came out of the work that we did is understanding that this is a demand-side problem. I mean, Andrew put it quite nicely in recognizing that this is a derived demand. So yes, you do need the right kind of skills in the system, and that's what the education system does. How you restructure that system, you still have to provide the skills that the economy needs to grow, to produce, to consume. And in that context, you still have to find that matching components around all of this. So while that may be necessary, and that's a whole different conversation around whether we're getting the right quality of outcomes out of the education system, they still need to go somewhere for it to contribute. And what does that look like is really what we're saying is some of the fundamental problems we have within the system.
Okay, thanks. Andrew?
So I'm presuming the question was about the employment tax incentive. Who does the money go to? How does it flow? And that's a very useful question because it allows me to explain something that's really interesting if you're interested in tax policy and the public finance analytics. So if you want to subsidize the employment or the incomes of low-wage employees, you can do that through either the demand or the supply side. You can do that either by supplementing the income of the wage earner. In other words, if you're, and this is how the American earned income tax credit works, you're a low-wage worker, you've only earned $10,000 in the year, you submit your tax return, it's confirmed with the evidence that comes in from the employers, and your $10,000 that you've earned for the year is then supplemented by a cash payment from the tax authorities, from the Revenue Service to you that raises your earnings for the year to $15,000 a year. That's how a tax incentive operating on the employee side works. You can also supplement the income of the employer, and that's how our youth employment and tax incentive is designed. The employer, in its tax return to SARS, says, I've employed these people, they qualify because they're young people and in the first year of work. They earned 4,000 Rand a month. and so they fall below the threshold below which the tax incentive applies, and I therefore qualify for a tax incentive of 1,000 Rand a month, 10,000 Rand for the year, whatever, and that is a reduction in the employer's company tax obligation. Now, you can immediately say that's only going to work if you're a taxpayer as the employer, but in principle, if you don't have a corporate tax liability, it can be a creditable benefit. You can have a cash flow back from SARS to you to say, yes, you don't have a tax liability, or tax liability is so much, here's what the tax credit is worth, and so you get that back anyway. So that's about how the money flows. Now, the important point I want to make for the economists in the room is, on paper, when you draw the labor demand and supply curves, it doesn't matter whether you're implementing through the tax, through the employee side versus the employer side. You can argue in welfare theoretic terms that the welfare outcomes will be the same, everything will balance out, labor demands will shift, or labor demand from the employer side will shift, or labor supply from the employees will shift in ways that balance out. But of course, for administrative purposes, it makes a big difference whether you're administering tax credits to employees or operating through the corporate tax system. And it's not so clear that the welfare arguments are entirely valid. There are behavioral considerations to take into account as well.
Thank you. Okay, let's open up to the floor. When I was still classified as a youth, one of my bosses talked to me about the GTPQ principle. Do you know what it is? Get to the point quickly. So I'm going to allow one question per person, and could you make it as concise and short as possible? So we're going to start with the table in the middle. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. So question 1, question 2, and question 3 belongs to the gentleman at the back.
Thank you, everyone, for the insightful discussion and conversation. My name is Bonani Mavata. I'm a master's candidate at Nelson Mandela University. I actually had 2 questions, questions that I thought were very interesting. If I can, I'll just keep them short. Andrew, you mentioned that the benefits of ETIs are so short-lived that they hardly make an impact on the unemployment rate. Do you harbor the same do you have the same opinion about, let me just see, about active labor marketing programs as well? And my question, the next question goes to Tim and Ulrika. What are the challenges that sort of like inhibit National Treasury, for example, from collecting evidence that speaks to the cost effectiveness of these interventions, of interventions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question. It was from this table here.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking discussions. So there's a very interesting infographic that was displayed where the OECD has got an aging and shrinking population, whereas Africa has the youngest population. So when we're looking at solutions for youth unemployment, should we not maybe zoom out and look at it from a global perspective as opposed to a local perspective only? Because I mean, there's no local demand for labor in SA, but there is global demand for that. So could we maybe create programs that enable young people to immigrate and access labor market opportunities or schooling opportunities, which will also increase remittances to the people that are left behind? It increases living standards. And I know that there's going to be a conversation about the brain drain, but how can we talk about the brain drain when the brains are sitting at home and are doing nothing? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman at the back.
Hi, Dr. Kola. Should cash transfer programs be viewed as labor market interventions or primarily as social safety nets? And what does that framing imply for policy choices, in your opinion?
Okay, that's for Tim and maybe Ulrika. Okay, so Andrew, the first question goes to you.
So a very good question. Are we looking at short-term impacts or not in labour market activation programs? And the answer is it depends. And it's important to think about whether there are long-term or short-term implications. So when it's a public employment program and you employ more people in schools, that's an ongoing cost. It's not going to pay for itself. It continues to be a fiscal cost over time. The benefit is in the improved schooling that comes from it, and it also has beneficial effects in giving people work opportunities. So there are long-term benefits there, but you've got to think through them analytically quite carefully. When you get to many of the kinds of things that are done by the Small Enterprise Development Organization or the Department of Employment and Labour or the Jobs Fund, then it's helpful to start thinking about asset creation, which, of course, was the point that I've made about the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was a huge investment in assets. It wasn't by any means just an employment program. But the biggest public employment program the world has ever seen was the Chinese government's, in the late Maoist era, 1970s, Winter Works program. The Winter Works program, at its peak in the late 1970s, employed 100 million people, improving roads, clearing fields, digging water wells. And it seemed at the time to many analysts that this was just sort of employment, a bit of cash transfers into rural areas. But actually it built infrastructure in rural areas that after the 1980s, when China decentralized, massively changed the structure of ownership of land in rural areas, those investments, particularly in water and irrigation systems, became the asset base of households who were able to take advantage of those and hugely increase agricultural productivity in China. So there's a great example of a massive intervention in the circumstances of the Chinese economy in the 1970s that created assets. I don't think we should be digging water wells so much. We should certainly be building houses. We've got to think about asset creation as part of what we want to achieve in our employment program.
Thanks. Tim first, and then Ulrika.
Sure. Thanks so much for your very interesting questions. On the first question on monitoring and evaluation and collecting data, which I think has been emphasized quite a bit, which I'm happy to hear about, and I'm happy to hear you repeat it or bring it up again. First is what Ulrika brought up, and hopefully she can speak to it more, is just deliberately embedding rigorous M&E monitoring and evaluation frameworks within policies themselves, right? So it's a given, it's expected, it's planned, it's not an additional thing that as academics get to do and put in a nice publication maybe one day, you know? So to have it embedded from the start, I'm not sure, maybe Olga can speak about the feasibility of that within government, but that's certainly one aspect of my response to that. The second, just from, you know, being able to, if there isn't a rigorous or comprehensive enough M&E framework within existing policy teams, so to speak, if we were to use existing or secondary data, there are some gaps there. I mean, you can be creative, and many economists in the room here and outside are, in many ways, my colleagues here, but often the information available in surveys, for instance, is too limited to allow us to identify who we need to identify. For instance, in the quarterly labor force survey with respect to the SRD grant, this is a good example, I think, there are some questions which ask about, ask each unemployed adult, how do you support yourselves through remittances or support from friends or family, and then specific grants, right? So you can identify recipients of each of the pre-existing grants, shall we say. 6 years on, even though, granted, the policy experienced a different trajectory to pre-existing grants, there's still no SRD grant receipt question in our core labor force survey, which is strange in my head because it's the only transfer, it's the only grant that makes explicit use of a labor market criterion for targeting. Granted, its primary goal isn't to improve labor market outcomes, it's to provide support to the unemployed, right? But the GHS has it. And the QLFS, granted it's in a different team, yeah, I'm not sure. So there are gaps in existing data sources that I think can pretty easily be filled, putting aside competition for additional questions and surveys and changes at Stats SA. And then lastly, which Amina would be able to speak in more detail than I would, getting both sufficient access to and merging of administrative data, which is incredibly powerful, as her and other people in the room's work has shown in creating credible evaluation evidence for policies. So I hope that answers that first question. And then the second question at the back
was about cash transfers.
Yes, should cash transfers be viewed as, I think, primarily an ALMP or a social safety net? That was the question, right? Certainly depends on the transfer, right? Cash transfers around the world, here as well, take many different forms, and they're designed for different reasons to achieve different goals. So I guess my first part of the response would be depends on the goal, right? If it has nothing to do with the labor market, why would it be an ALMP, right? However, for the SRD, I would argue, why not both? And granted, things can get murky there in terms of policy design. And again, the SRD wasn't designed to be a labor market tool. It still isn't. But there are ways that we can think about how these policies can become complementary to achieving multiple objectives at once. So perhaps thinking about a cash plus component, where at its foundation, the cash provides foundational support, regular, expected support. And then you can think about what many colleagues in the room have spoken about before in terms of scaffolding, right? So depending on your circumstances, you get this particular type of complementary labor market link support. And the idea in that then is to provide a foundation to recipients while they receive the grant, but also over time, hopefully through that tailored support, if it's appropriate, so-called graduate out of the program, right? And no longer need to rely on the state for that support. So overall, it depends on the goal, but for some grants, why not both? Thanks.
Ulrike, I think I'll end with you, but let me ask Amina to respond.
Thanks, Tim. So you missed a little bit of the conversation yesterday because we went through a lot of the data gaps. We did this really nice exercise yesterday where I pushed the speakers, Stats SA, our colleagues from UCT and our colleagues from SARS to say, well, if you're going to fix the data gaps, what would you do? What do you want to do? And each of them have their own, everybody has their own wish list. Let me put it to you this way. There's no such thing as perfect data. It just doesn't exist. But there are ways in which you can combine various data sets, and the DG yesterday spoke about the Mzansi exchange and communicating between government departments and putting these data sets together and actually to answer these questions. Sometimes, if the questionnaire, if that box is not on the QLFS and it's not getting ticked, we're just not going to know in some ways. I just want to come back to this question about migration. Because it's an interesting one, and I think something that's like, I did some work on migration some years ago, looking at remittances from the Middle East to the Philippines and what that does and the economy and these kinds of things. And I think it's an interesting question. And I think it's maybe just under-researched at the moment for South Africa. We think a lot about immigration, coming into the country, but yeah, maybe we can think about also, immigration or what that would look out. And then two sides of that, right? You talked about brain drain and thinking about skilled migration, but what about unskilled migration? What does that look like? Thanks.
Thanks. Ulrike, we're going to end with you.
Okay, so Tim's covered us already on the cash transfers and whether you kind of see it as an ALMP or not. It depends on what the policy objective is and how you design it. From a complexity point of view, if you go through the theory of change and you understand exactly what it is that you're measuring, how much it's going to cost you, how do you know what success looks like, you're able to it would help you understand what the choices and the trade-offs you're making and what it deals with from a cost point of view to deal with that. Just on cost effectiveness, how we measure cost effectiveness is what's the cost of delivering a specific output. So in the ALMP, or in our current ALMP ecosystem, outputs look different, whether it goes from 15 minutes in a labor center to 2 days of work in the community work program, doing anything, whether you are in a training program for like a 2-day workshop. And it's always difficult, because the outputs are different, to measure the costs associated with delivering that and comparing it and benchmarking it, which one works better. And one of the things that we're proposing, and we'll use the budget process to deal with this hopefully, is develop a standard set of metrics that would allow us to have standard outputs that would allow for that kind of benchmarking of what it costs to deliver that output, in the same way that you kind of do with measuring full-time equivalents around all of this, or when you're measuring the labor intensity. So what's the ratio between the cost of delivering the full program relative to the wage component within that program? So for example, for infrastructure delivery, public employment programs, the labor intensity is a lot lower than you do for some of the social aspects, because you don't need to make that big CapEx investments that is needed. So when you do that kind of thing across in the PFM system, it would also allow you to then think about how you use that as a prioritization mechanism on moving money from some of those more expensive programs, depending on how you measure that output, into programs that can deliver the same kind of outcome at a cheaper rate. Thanks.
Okay. We're out of time. I would like to thank all the panelists. They did a great job, so can we give them a round of applause? And I am going to hand back to Vusi to break us for lunch. Thanks very much, everyone.